Hello, everyone. So you can all see my screen. My name is Sana. I'm a research associate at the American Planning Association. And this is our final PI webinar of the year on exploratory scenarios for hazard mitigation planning. Just some background for those of you who are not super familiar, PI is the Planning Information Exchange. It's one of the outcomes of an ongoing partnership between APA and FEMA in collaboration with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, covering a bunch of topics related to hazard mitigation planning, kind of the intersection of this field with other ones, and kind of a knowledge sharing place for planners, floodplain managers, and anyone else who might work in this area. Some logistical stuff with the certificates. You must participate in the entire or attend the entire hour session in order to qualify for CMs, for AICPs, and CECs for CFMs. Because this webinar is an hour, this will count for 1 credit for each. And AICP members can view the recording that will be posted on our website later. A note on this in a second. CFMs must watch live. AICPs can use the CM log to record the engagement. That is posted at the link on the bottom. You can also just Google APA PI, which is what I normally do, and you can find the webpage there as well. And for CFMs, certificates of attendance will be emailed within a week through ASFPM. And then some webinar logistics. You can join either through computer audio or phone call to listen in. If you are having audio troubles or maybe there's a lag, you can try using the call-in feature. That might help. If you have any comments, feel free to put them in the chat. And any questions, if you could put them in the Q&A function, just so they're not drowned out by comments, that'd be great. We're gonna aim to have around 10 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. So we're trying to get to as many of those as we can. And then, as I said, this webinar is being recorded. The slides from each of the presenters, as well as the recording, will be posted on the same website at APA. Within a few days, as I said, you can Noodle APA Pi. That might be your easiest way to access if you don't want to remember the link. And then getting into today, our 2 presenters are Joe DeAngelis, who is my research manager here at APA, and Brendan Irsfeld, who is the emergency management coordinator in Lane County, Oregon. I will stop sharing now, and Joe, if you want to take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sana. Let me share my screen real quick. All right, just give me a moment. All right, hopefully people can see my slides. I think, yeah, all set. Hey everyone, my name is Joe DeAngelis. Thank you for joining today. I'm a research manager with the American Planning Association, and I'm going to be talking a bit about the high-level basics of exploratory scenario planning, its potential applications for hazards, and hazard mitigation planning in particular. And I'm going to preview some of the findings of an upcoming report that we are working on here at APA. Then at the very end, I will turn things over to Brendan, who's going to talk a bit about this topic and kind of bring it down to earth into a local context and talk about his experience in using exploratory scenario planning as part of the mitigation planning process in Lane County, Oregon. So some basic stuff for now. This work is a product of a 3-year FEMA-funded project and part of our cooperating technical partnership with FEMA. So APA is a cooperating technical partner with FEMA. This work is focused, like I said before, on the use of exploratory scenario planning as a tool within the hazard mitigation planning process generally, but also within things like climate adaptation planning, which I'll touch on in a bit. So here's a really quick rundown of some of the work that we've done so far, just to give you a little bit of context. We started off with a high-level state of practice for both hazard mitigation planning and exploratory scenario planning. So how are these different sort of planning frameworks being used in isolation on their own today? What are the primary methods? What are the processes? Who are the people who do this kind of work? Things like that, real basic stuff. But then we also published a short publication back in 2023 that covered some of that high-level review of the state of practice, and I'll touch on that in a moment. We've also identified and completed a number of case studies of communities that have used exploratory scenario planning within their hazard mitigation or climate change adaptation work. And I say climate change adaptation because there's an important distinction, I think, here with regard to exploratory scenario planning. Within hazard mitigation planning, it is relatively rare for the time being for scenario planning to be used within hazard mitigation. And it sort of spurred the reason for this project. While in climate change adaptation, water resources management, other areas that are related to hazards, but not quite within that same bubble, it is much more widely used. So we're trying to identify, some of the things that are within those areas and see if there's carryover to the hazards world. We conducted a large set of expert and practitioner interviews. We conducted workshops, in-person workshops, one of which we held at the National Planning Conference a year ago, I believe, all focused on testing out exploratory scenario planning methods within the mitigation planning process. And ultimately in March, we're going to be releasing our full PAS report and a case studies sort of story map, an interactive story map that we're developing for exhibiting both this guidance and a wide array of examples from across the United States. A couple of years ago, I mentioned we released this PAS memo, this Planning Advisory Service memo. It's a short 5-page publication. It offers guidance to planners on and introduces them to the concept of scenario planning, which might be new-ish, and how to expand or consider their use of exploratory scenario planning within the mitigation and adaptation field. So definitely encourage you to check that out. Easiest way to get to it, honestly, I would just Google PAS memo and scenario planning, and it'll be one of the top 3 results that shows up there. Yep, so these are some of the things that are covered in that report. So before I go any further, I think we should get into the why we're doing this, right? What problem are we actually trying to solve here? And it might make sense to start with climate change, right? The ways in which that climate change is disrupting historical climate and weather patterns on a variety of scales. And it's different at the global, the regional, the local scale. This disruption poses a particular challenge to lots of different traditional planning methods, including hazard mitigation planning. So, for example, we can't really say exactly how much sea level might rise in a specific location over a precise, specific number of years. We instead rely on models that are based on a whole variety of inputs that result in general ranges, but don't tell us exact numbers. And those models, they might be used to project things like greenhouse gas emissions and associated atmospheric and oceanic warming and what the possible pathways there are for future sea level rise, and things like, rates of ice melt and changing development patterns in coastal areas. These are all different things that have different levels of uncertainty. And each of the variables that go into these different models are themselves influenced by other outside inputs. In the scenario planning world, those are called drivers of change. How do we consider things like, the potential for rapid housing or commercial development in a particular location? Those are other uncertainties that are also part of this conversation. So there's this weird dynamic where there's this multitude of variables, and there's potential for extreme outcomes. And you have these uncertainties that are layered on top of each other. And that can sort of be described as deep uncertainty. So how do you actually do any planning in a world of deep uncertainty where there's that many layers of uncertainty sort of piled on top of each other? So that brings us to scenario planning itself. We sort of characterize scenario planning into 2 different buckets. if you were to get into the weeds on the literature on this, there's a whole variety of other ways that you can characterize different types of scenario planning. But we are using two different buckets. There's normative scenario planning and exploratory scenario planning. So normative scenario planning, this is probably the one that planners in particular are maybe a little bit more familiar with. Normative scenario planning is all about creating different scenarios on how to reach a particular target or goal. So it might be used in the context of something like community visioning at the beginning of a planning process, or maybe when a particular decision needs to be reached during some public outreach session, right? Um, One question might be, what do we want to achieve as a community in 30 years? And how are we going to get there? Well, we've identified as the planning team a couple of different options that you, the community, can help us decide on. So here's a couple of options for getting there. Which of these do we want to pick that's going to guide the rest of our planning process? Um, Maybe option scenario one is too expensive, and scenario two is doesn't really fit with how our community operates. It's too complicated. So we've come to a consensus, and we think that we want to go with scenario three. That's the one that we want to pick. That's going to guide the rest of our planning work. This is an oversimplified version, and you probably understand that. It's the oversimplified way of describing this, but it is a tool that planners and communities do actively use today. Exploratory scenario planning is a bit different. The main purpose of exploratory scenario planning is all around navigating uncertainty. So the main goal is to identify and explore different driving forces of change, different trends that exist in the world today and at the community level, understanding them and using those trends, the direction of those trends, to prepare for future uncertainties. So exploratory scenario planning is all about prioritizing those different trends, those different drivers of change, and identifying the ones that have the highest impacts and the highest levels of uncertainty. And then you create some scenarios of multiple plausible futures by looking at those different trends in comparison to one another. And I'll get into some detail on this in the next couple of slides. And then once you have these different possible scenarios sort of laid out on a grid, you can start drafting some viable responses to them. And those responses would be things like projects and services and policies, the stuff of plans, right? The things that come out of normal, typical plans. So scenario planning can be exploratory scenario planning can be used to help mitigate or overcome some of the traditional challenges, potentially, of planning in making projects and services and initiatives a little bit more nimble and robust and adaptable to different potential outcomes in the future, not just one future that you're planning for, but for a range of potential outcomes in the future. So you might be able to look at the future potential outcomes related to sea level rise and maybe consider those outcomes in the context of, new housing development or commercial growth in a particular area in the community, and then build your policies and initiatives and services based on that range of outcomes that might be happening there. So ultimately, you might be choosing to pursue strategies that satisfy the widest array of scenarios, right? So yeah, at three of these four scenarios, we can satisfy with this kind of a strategy, and that would be a good strategy to choose. Or you might be pursuing things like no regrets actions, for example, that maybe have relatively low costs. They're just good for the community in some way, but they also account for a wide range of potential futures. Now, the benefit of exploratory scenario planning is hedging against extreme outcomes as well. So planning for projects or services or policies and things like that can be used to hedge against those extreme type of outcomes. So maybe it won't satisfy the widest array, but they're particularly risky and dangerous type things that might be happening in the future. So you want to plan for those in advance too. So you'd develop strategies intended to cater towards those types of scenarios. And then over time, you would be reviewing and updating these scenarios as part of your plan update cycle, and you'd make adjustments accordingly. All sounds like super easy, right? So I'm going to run through a real quick overview of how this process actually looks in reality. So what does this actual process look like? It's a multi-stage process, I would say. It's usually organized around a series of workshops. It can be anywhere from like 6 to 10 or 11 steps, depending on who you talk to and what model you're using. But let me be clear, the one that I'm talking about right now, it's probably the most well-known and popular of the frameworks, but this is just one way of doing it. You can do exploratory scenario planning in other ways. This isn't the only way to do it. Um, Starting off, you sort of develop this focal question. This is the question that's going to guide the rest of the planning process. It's really just intended to build the boundaries, the box around what the planning process is going to look like and the question that you're trying to solve. What are we trying to address in this community in the next 10, 15, 20 years? And then you're going to brainstorm some trends around this that are based off of that focal question. You and participants in a workshop will identify what those major driving forces are, those major trends that are related to that original question. What are the main challenges and issues within the community now and into the future? Is it the threat of sea level rise or economic decline or growth, housing growth or decline, an aging community, technological change, political change, infrastructure on the decline or rise, these sorts of things? Those are the trends and driving forces that you want to be considering here as you brainstorm. And then you're going to rank those trends. You're going to identify which of those trends are most uncertain and which are going to have the highest impacts and are most important. You're looking to find those trends that are most uncertain and are most important. And those are going to be used in the next step, which is going to be creating some scenario matrices, they're called. Here we're plotting, like I mentioned before, we're plotting those trends that are most uncertain and most important against each other. And we're looking to identify how they might interact across a wide range of potential outcomes. So you can see an example of what that looks like here. So this is the matrix. This is a matrix that we created for a hypothetical community that we used in a workshop that we were conducting. Here are the main potential drivers, and they're general drivers. Usually they'd be a little more specific than this. These are general ones to sort of describe the point that we're trying to make. So here the main potential drivers are climate or hazard impacts and economic change over, say, a roughly 20 or 30-year period. So we plot out the general range of those climate impacts, ranging from, limited climate impacts to extreme on one end. And we plot out economic change from stagnation at the bottom to booming at the top. And in each quadrant, we're describing the different outcomes for each. So you can see in scenario A, for example, it has both a booming economy and limited climate impacts. So we bullet point out what are the different characteristics of those types of changes within that scenario. Scenario D is sort of the opposite, right? It's bottom right. You're looking at extreme climate impacts and economic decline. And what are the characteristics of that potential future? A community would do this not just like for these two, right? They could look at a few and plot out a few different ones. The next piece of this, after they do this plotting exercise, is the organizers would take all that information from the different matrices they've developed, and they would create narratives, stories of each potential outcome. So they'll write a more thorough and expanded exploration of the outcomes within each of those potential futures. And the goal for that is really to tell a concise story about each scenario that could be more easily understood by the people who are participating in that process. After that, you would take those narratives and you'd explore the implications and answer the question of what should be done. What should we be doing in each of these different narratives to either avoid or to cultivate, to build strategies to do something about that future. And then in the last step, you're going to identify the most robust strategies, the ones that are reoccurring in different areas according to different scenarios, right? So what are the strategies and the actions that are common across different future scenarios? Generally, in this process, you'd be looking to find the strategies that are going to work in a variety of futures. You also might, again, like I said before, elect to include some strategies that might not be common, but that do hedge against especially extreme or poor outcomes. All of this feels a little bit antiseptic and academic. Totally get that. So what is the relationship with this and hazard mitigation? Like, how do these things fit together? So a lot of this might not necessarily be news to the people in the room who are listening today, but hazard mitigation planning, the goal of it is to reduce loss of life and property by minimizing the impacts of natural disasters. So it involves identifying risks and vulnerabilities to natural hazards. You're building strategies that can reduce the exposure of people and property, all with the ultimate intention of saving lives. So while mitigating the impacts of natural hazards can be done through a whole array of different things, there's the small n, small h, natural hazards mitigation, right? Um, there's a formalized practice here too, hazard mitigation planning. There's a formalized practice of a set of policies, legislative requirements, regulations, things that you do at the local level that pretty much everyone does in a standardized way. And these all originate at the federal level. They apply to states and tribes and local governments. So you've got this robust suite of federal and state regulatory requirements and incentives, and it's all led to the widespread adoption of this work across the U.S. Um, FEMA has this process that they have, and that we work on and through, determining the planning area, building the planning team, all these things that you see on the screen, all of it ultimately leading to developing strategies and actions, and then adopting, monitoring, and updating your plan every 5 years or so. And this is a good process. It's led to reduced loss of life and property and led to probably better overall outcomes for communities. It's really easy for us at a distance to just say, hey, hazards are super uncertain and climate change is even more uncertain. So we should use this whole new model, right? And use it in our hazard mitigation planning process on top of that process. And we should fix the problems that are within the existing mitigation planning process. It's obviously not that simple at all. A more formalized process like hazard mitigation planning has established ways of doing things. It's really difficult to just graft on a different technique like exploratory scenario planning to this established process. You're going to hear it later on in Brendan's presentation, what some of those challenges are that they had in reality going through that process. Also, as an established practice, people have been doing things this way for a really long time. So you've got this perceived added complexity and newness of scenario planning. That's also a challenge. And climate change is also complicating their process even further. Scenario planning, there's sort of different ways that it might apply at the local level, but people tend to see it, and it tends to be perceived as like an overall strategic framework for organizing all of your planning efforts in the community. You have to sort of redo everything around this effort, and that's illustrated over on the left. This big new way of conceptualizing things. And for lots of communities, that's probably unrealistic. They don't want to do that. There's institutional momentum. Things are generally working. You're happy with how your mitigation plan is already being developed. You don't want to actually change things to that extent. You really just maybe want to make it a little bit more robust and adaptable to different potential futures. But I think that there's actually some good news here. It can also be used tactically. Those other two options that you see on the screen that aren't in the red box. It can be used tactically within an existing planning process or framework, or as an input to the planning process and framework. And I think that FEMA's guidance on using other different planning techniques and tools within their overall guidance is good in this regard. I think it allows for this level of for other tools to be used within that process. So yeah, those are general ways that we think that it applies to these kinds of to hazard mitigation planning process. In general, through our work that we've done so far, we've identified two major elements within the mitigation planning process that we think could benefit from using exploratory scenario planning. So first is in the risk assessment phase of the work, and you're assessing risk and capabilities here. So here you're doing the work of identifying hazards, you're profiling future events, you're doing an inventory of assets, you're estimating, losses based on exposure and vulnerability, all that stuff. All of those things that you're already doing for the mitigation plan, they can be excellent inputs to an exploratory scenario planning work, that sort of workshop type things that I was doing before. All of those items can feed into things like identifying your trends and drivers of change, your ranking and prioritizing things according to levels of uncertainty and importance and impact. As detail that can feed into those narratives that I was talking about before, those scenario narratives that I was talking about. So in this way, the information that's generated maybe at this phase of the mitigation planning process can be fed into an exploratory scenario planning work and workshops that might be done. It's an input there. But let's look at some potential outputs of an exploratory scenario planning process. We look at the next stage, stage 3, developing your mitigation strategy. Here we see some natural alignment between the robust actions and strategies that might come out of exploratory scenario planning work. The intention of this stage of the mitigation planning process is all about developing what those long-term strategies are around future risk, exposure, vulnerability, and the actual capacity of the community to address that risk and pursue mitigation. So these types of strategies that were potentially generated during an exploratory scenario planning process that is centered on hazards, it can be extremely helpful in potentially informing the strategies that are developed at this stage of the mitigation planning process. Just to review our state of activities that we're at right now. So a lot of this, what I was just talking about before, is feeding into the final item that's here, this PAS report that's going to be coming out in a couple months, and a series of case study story maps. We're going to have 15 to 20 or so case studies exhibited in a story map format on the APA website that we'll be releasing. And again, these are just the main goals that we're pursuing for this work, is looking at the framework of the mitigation planning process and identifying the ways that it actually can be useful within that process, not as something intended to sort of transform that process in any way. Is the report structure and the kind of questions that we're looking to answer. Really the main ones, and the main guidance that's going to be coming out of the report is, how do we revise this process, the exploratory scenario planning process, to be useful and to apply to mitigation planning? And then how do we use the findings of that revised process to actually inform mitigation actions and strategies? So that's all coming in 2025, in March. We're going to be working on a course as well, virtual / in person, that we might be touring around in 2025 and 2026. And then, like I mentioned before, we're going to have some story maps with case studies. I'm going to stop there and bring things down to earth a little bit, like I said before, and turn things over to Brendan. Yeah, Brendan's going to discuss what this all might look like at the local level, and specifically within the context of the mitigation planning process, and some of the very real issues and challenges of actually doing this work in reality. So I will stop sharing, and yeah, Brendan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Joe. And could I just get a quick confirmation if you're seeing my screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Senna. So hello, everyone. As Joe said, my name is Brendan Irsfeld. I'm a emergency coordinator, hazard planner for the Office of Emergency Management in Lane County, Oregon. I recently facilitated an update to our county's multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. And I employed a version of exploratory scenario planning as part of this process. Met Joe a couple of years ago while I was in this process. That's how we connected. And so this is just kind of a very brief, and I would say bare bones application of what we did, but some of, like Joe alluded to, some of the interesting applications and benefits that it had to our process. So I'll just mention again, I'm with the Office of Emergency Management. So in Lane County, we have the overall natural hazards mitigation plan and also the community wildfire protection plan. And these are the two that I'm mainly responsible for maintaining and facilitating, and working with our regional partners in implementing those action items. The mitigation plan was just updated October of 2023, and that's the plan I'll be talking about in this case study. So for those of you who are not familiar with Lane County, Oregon, I'll just orient you a little geographically, kind of to our place. We are in the western part of the state of Oregon, kind of west central in the southern Willamette Valley. These dotted lines I have here generally follow the mountain ranges that sort of cut the land area into thirds. So we have three very distinct ecoregions of kind of our coast and coast range foothills to the west, near the Pacific coastline, the Willamette Valley in the center, and then on the eastern side, the forested foothills of the Cascade Range, and that goes up to the crest. So it presents a lot of climate and sort of natural hazard profile of both warm weather, cold weather, wildfires, and severe winter storms being two of the most predominant and most recent for our history. But in addition to that, Joe mentioned climate change in terms of the uncertainty principle. But Oregon also being a state on the Ring of Fire, we have the Cascadia subduction zone about 70 miles off the coastland of Lane County. And so we have this interesting profile of both uncertainty in climate-driven hazards, but also a certainty/uncertainty hazard of an earthquake we know is going to happen, but we're not quite sure if it's going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, 10 to 50, 50 to 100. But we do know it's going to happen and have a significant impact. So in sort of updating the mitigation plan, from our risk profile, just in a general sense, we have these three sort of different areas that we all have to address and the situation is changing rapidly. The areas that they're impacting are becoming much more significant. The severity and the speed of which the incident is developing, particularly wildfires and ice storms, is becoming much more rapid. So in the effort to update the mitigation plan with some really good and tangible action items over a large geography, Lane County is about the size of the state of Connecticut, for comparison. And then all these jurisdictional partners here in our region are incorporated cities and unincorporated places. We really were thinking about how can we engage a conversation that's going to help us organize all this information and probably some of the competing priorities of those who are going to be more interested in talking about flooding and the tsunami and earthquake threat on our western side of the county compared to those on the eastern side that have been dealing with significant wildfires over the past several years. So, and also looking at the requirements that Joe mentioned in FEMA's mitigation plan, I'll point out kind of this middle area of must give an opportunity to include those communities. So this was also a reason we looked at exploratory scenario planning as a way of making an engaging and accessible workshop type, something that we could bring to people of different technical backgrounds, expertise, level of familiarity with the hazard profile into the same workshop, and be able to have them communicate with each other, not just for them to exchange ideas, but also, quite frankly, with a limited staff and kind of limited time frame, how much could we get out of different areas and stakeholders with the most minimal sort of time commitment? Because, quite frankly, we're very under the gun when this plan update was kicked off. So there was sort of this challenge of our 5-year deadline coming up and how we could best apply this process, but in a way that was still going to keep us on track and not overburden our resources. Again, as Joe mentioned, the uncertainty principle is really why we thought exploratory scenario planning might be an effective addition to the current process. Overall, this plan did follow the prescribed FEMA risk assessment, understanding the risk profile, developing mitigation ideas, prioritizing actions, and then assigning and delegating actions to the various stakeholders and partners in the region. But that element of sort of, do we really want to rely on the historical record as we are doing that risk assessment? Is the last 20 to 25 years really going to tell us what the next 5 to 10 are going to look like? Because the last 5 or so years have looked very, very strange and different for the overall historical record. So again, this was sort of one of the driving factors of why we thought this would be a good addition to our process. So as Joe pointed out and summarized in the process, we developed a focal question that was going to cover the entire region, but we were going to split our process up amongst the 3 regions and give them their own workshop space. I'll elaborate a little bit more on that in the coming slides. But this was the overall focal question that arose out of some focus group interviews with stakeholders in each of the regions. The goal of hazard mitigation and reducing risk, protect life and property, safeguard investments, and strengthen community resilience. And then having that part underlined at the end against multiple natural hazards. As everybody in our process recognized, we are challenged with having to deal with increasing fire threats, increasing winter storm threat. We have multiple flooding seasons, and also what do you do about the earthquake looming off in the distance? So the first workshop, we went through kind of the traditional process. We brainstormed driving forces of change. We ranked those driving forces based on the critical certainty or uncertainty principle. Do you think you know what this is going to look like five years from now in terms of the situation? Is this something that you know is going to be a very big issue, but you really have no idea what that trend might look like in 5 years? And kind of what I have displayed on this slide is some of the results of what types of driving factors that our participants had in each of the regions. But kind of in the arrows next to each of the steps is sort of what we found the workshop to ultimately result in as an output. We really, through the conversations in these workshops and engagements, our stakeholders talked about their ability to either advance or not advance hazard mitigation in whatever form that took, whether it was nature-based solutions, whether it was an infrastructure project or a community capacity development. or if it was just a matter of funding, as it often is. So what Workshop 1 really did more so than set us up to try and develop future scenarios as the process prescribes, is it really gave us a capability assessment, kind of quick and direct with our participants, rather of just collecting data of assets and inventorying assets, really getting in conversation with people about, we have X locations to potentially shelter people, but quite frankly, half of them are not in a condition to be spun up very quickly if we had an emerging situation. So, take those half offline as one example, and through those conversations, really get a sense of what are each of our 3 ecoregions facing in this risk profile if a number of different hazard incidents were to occur. So working through that process, we ended up developing sort of this kind of interesting, typically you'll see a 2x2 structure as the Cascades group did, of picking 2 driving factors that will help you then create 4 scenario futures. But the Coast and Valley Workshop really had a tough time settling on 2. So they really harped on these 3. And initially, this was going to be our approach is, well, how are we going to kind of develop futures with these 3 intersecting kind of factors? And the initial idea, as you see somewhat visually displayed here, is to create, for those 2 groups, 3 scenarios instead of 4, with some interrelation of the different 3 driving forces of change that the group participants thought were most pertinent to their area. What we found, though, is that as we were trying to develop those scenario narratives, they were very much taking the focus away from the actual risk profile and hazard threat. So in an interest of using these to create very clear action items that can be acted on, and the challenge for specificity in those action items, if you're in this work, I'm sure you've seen is increasing. It's no longer kind of a general, reduce general risk of fire by educating public, what's the specific public education campaign? What's the kind of priority mileage of the fuels reduction that you're going to perform over a period of time? And we found that developing future scenarios based on these driving factors really took the focus of the conversation somewhat away from identifying those actions. So what we decided to do instead is, for the second workshop, we wanted to basically develop different scenario incidents for our participants to examine and kind of evaluate in terms of identifying impacts and actions. So basically taking the outputs of the first workshop, sort of storing them away as part of our documentation and our process, and then using the risk assessment that had been completed to this point, we developed 3 scenario types of what we would call a max threat incident for basically the general profile for each of our regions, which is the seismic, a cold weather incident, and a warm weather incident. So instead of future scenario narratives, we develop sort of disaster scenario narratives. This is an example of one I actually developed presenting this case study about a year back. It used an example of a disaster that we had about a year ago, which were 2 very severe ice storms. But essentially, we provided a basic narrative of the situation of what the incident has occurred, time and date, time of year, a few details about some of the initial reports, direct impacts, and some cascading secondary hazards. And this is really just to get people thinking about what is breaking, what is happening in the incident. But as opposed to something like a tabletop exercise where you're then, the next prompt is, well, how would you respond to it? What we then ask people to do is think about, okay, so what are the assets that are breaking? Let's start identifying and listing those impacts for each type of scenario. You'll see here kind of the icons of the FEMA Community Lifeline model. This was a very helpful way of kind of getting participants to think, what transportation issues are having, what is the energy situation that is at issue, are there communication problems, do we have a mass care element that is part of this scenario? And as people identify particular assets and build on the capabilities conversation they had from the previous workshop, we were able to list a series of impacts for each of these types, and then brainstorm some of the actions of how we would address it. What is the type of action that we'd want to address? And who is the best partner or in position having authority to actually implement that action item? So essentially what we did is set up stations for our participants, and they would review each one of those scenarios, list the impacts, talk about the actions, and then I would have them rotate and they would evaluate a second scenario. So each group was able to evaluate at least 2 of the 3 scenarios in the time that were available. So the impacts and mitigation strategies turn into action items, and we sort of combined everything at the end of these workshops to see how well did they address if we're having a seismic event, if we're having a mass fire event, in addition to a heat wave, or this is something of a severe winter storm and there may be flooding implications. How many action items can account for as many of those possible incidents as possible? So as Joe mentioned, you kind of can create a matrix and sort of list things out. And these are just some of the examples from our process. From these conversations. Resilience hubs is kind of the one that sticks out just because I've been seeing it as a word in a lot of funding more recently, and it was a topic of conversation. Considering whether you have an incident where you're either sheltered in place or kind of trapped in, or you had to be evacuated, this is becoming a more popular kind of idea, and it's something that identified as a really robust strategy. We highlighted it very prominently in the action item section of our mitigation plan, and it has since been leveraged to secure some grant funding to begin developing some locations throughout our county. But again, this is just kind of a helpful representation of looking at if it's this, that, or the other, how many of the things that we can be working on now or studying now or better understanding is going to help us account for any one of those things, since we know that they are likely to occur in some extent and severity. So ultimately, what I would say for exploratory scenario planning, in kind of the adapted way, it wasn't, I would say, the most traditional way it's been used in really using the kind of elements of the first workshop to create future scenarios, kind of an adaptation that we thought was helpful for our audience type in particular, because it was a lot of our technical partners, these sort of doers who are going to be able to implement the action items. But again, it helped us vet a wide range of our local and regional capacities. So we knew what kind of ability that we had and where we had gaps in ability. Identifying action items to update and include in the plan, not only for its qualification kind of through FEMA's mitigation grant programs, but also to be leveraged for other grant opportunities that colleagues in other departments of our county government are looking to implement as well. A lot of our risk profile can be used and action items that we can point to and say something that they're doing really complements with this effort. It's a great way moving forward and reducing risk overall. I point out element A here again in FEMA's policy about how we can engage a wide, diverse audience and maximize time and resources when we may be staff constrained or resource constrained, and then really being able to balance understanding the different regional impacts that we are going to have across a wide geography and wide range of diverse community types. Some challenge and obstacles I will mention, the time horizon of kind of mitigation plans and that formal structure, as Joe mentioned, they're updated every 5 years. Best practice, if you're updating a mitigation plan, would give yourself anywhere from 9 to maybe 15 months, 18 if it's a really robust mitigation. And it's really kind of challenging to think about sort of future scenarios, develop the level of detail while still keeping a focus on sort of that 40-month implementation plan. So where this has been used in more sort of comprehensive planning or long-range planning of that 15 to 20-year horizon, I did find that sort of keeping the focus on what are we going to accomplish in these next 4.5 to 5 years as part of this version of the plan to be something that is difficult to address in kind of executing the process that's typically done. There's also an element of how much guidance you need during the workshops themselves and sort of walking through the thought exercises. Is it more instructing the participants about what you're talking about, why you're focusing just on driving forces of change, or why you're focusing on just uncertainties, versus facilitating a natural discussion? And I found this to be, of course, a little bit more difficult at the beginning of a workshop, but as time, first half an hour or so go through, the conversation started to flow a little bit more naturally. And then I think whether you're doing it in sort of the traditional way of developing your scenarios from that kind of first input of workshop one versus doing what we might do and creating hazard scenario incidents, how narrow or broad is the detail that you want to put into those? I imagine you could do an entire day of a tabletop-like exercise, just evaluating things all the way down on tertiary levels of impact, and kind of really walk through a robust exploration of all the different elements for sort of these max threat incidents. But sometimes if that's not your audience type, if it's a more community-based thing and you really want to talk about hazard mitigation at the property or neighborhood level, it might be a little bit more of a broad, kind of generalized description that's a bit more accessible and really initiates conversation amongst your participants. But again, it really helped us parse out these capabilities, exchanging a lot of ideas between our land conservationists, our public works, our public health partners, community advocates, really helped a lot of different ideas and considerations enter these conversations to work out what really the problem or kind of contributing risk factor was. Knowledge gaps as well. A lot of the action items came out to, we just don't know how that might play out, and we really need to explore the issue further. Actions in themselves to go understand your risk profile better. And then yielding specific, project-specific mitigation action items in the plan itself. So I would just say my recommendations, having just done this once, identify how you would want to use it in the process. If this is something you'd want to add to your process, how much you can scale the engagement. As in this case study, we basically ran 3 processes at the same time for each region. It was helpful in our example, but may not be as useful in the context of the community you're working with. Defining audience type, how technical, how general the public is, if it's senior elected officials, it's a mixture of all those types. And then lastly, how specific you want your scenarios to be and kind of what tools will help you to get there. So I guess I'll just leave a closing thought of, if it's really about the scenario process, the scenarios that you develop, or the process that's engaged to get there. And that's just kind of my closing reflection, is I think there are a lot of potential benefits to using exploratory scenario planning or elements of it as complements to the traditional mitigation processes. Some tools come online, such as AI and some kind of modeling programs. I'm kind of interested to see how those tools can help us kind of implement these thought exercises with different community members in really advancing the conversation about sort of hazard mitigation incrementally in sort of addressing the long-term, but very forthcoming and have already arrived impacts of climate change sort of throughout our region. So with that, Joe, that concludes what I have to say. So I'll wrap it up, or send it back to you.
Yes, awesome. Thank you guys both so much for those presentations. They were very great. We can get into the Q&A right now. I'll kind of just go in order at the moment. So our first question from Valerie was, how do you quantify a scenario's impact in terms of cost and lives and environmental outcomes if the scenario itself is kind of a what if, and you have all these interdependent things going on?
I can start first, and Brendan, if you have any contributions, you can jump in right after. But I would say this is like one of the central problems potentially within this process, right? Because like Brendan, you said at the very end, you said the word thought exercise, and I think that there are some pitfalls in this just being a sort of academic thought exercise. You're just doing in a workshop thing that's not generating like real data and information that is highly useful and applicable for a more technical type of planning that hazard mitigation planning might be. So that is a challenge. But I would say that there are some examples I would maybe point to, and I might mention this later in reference to another question, but some of the work that's been done in Grand Haven, Michigan by Dr. Richard Norton, who there's ways to narrow this work down so it's not as so far ranging, and where they just focused on like very realistic future scenarios around flooding and zoning building potential. And they looked at just those two, and they used historical hazards as ways to inform those future scenarios. So like especially severe historic hazards becoming the normal type of a scenario that might be in the future could be seen as that more extreme type of an outcome, but that becomes more common. And then using a lot of the data and the information and the risk and the vulnerability that was actually in place for that very real historical outcome as a way to inform those future issues. So I think that's one area that I did want to highlight as a way of sort of grounding this work a bit.
Yeah, I can just add it that kind of goes back to the consideration of just how much detail and sort of your audience type. And depending on the type of hazard, like I could probably quantify and present a quantification of max incident loss for an earthquake scenario a little bit easier than I could for a severe ice storm. I have data. There are studies done by state agencies that help us estimate the plausible potential across those different scenarios for certain hazard types. So I would say that if you have access to that data, then it is possible to sort of incorporate that level if you want to quantify things by, property loss, loss of life, economic disruption. Those could be useful metrics to help kind of people understand the severity of disruption that could occur.
Great, thank you. The next question is directed at Joe, but I imagine both of you can answer if you desire. Could you tell us about the main authors or institutions behind the most popular exploratory scenario planning process? Maybe what some alternatives are. And then one thing I'm wondering is if there are any other resources outside of FEMA's that you found helpful along the way in navigating this.
So there's like maybe a many layered type of a answer to this one. There's no like true like single originator, right, of this process of exploratory scenario planning. It goes way back. It has its roots in like large scale like global geopolitics and high level like corporate strategy, like that type of thing, right? After World War II. A lot of it grew out of that. Today, I would look into, and I did want to mention too, this method as like the most like quote unquote popular, this sort of 2x2 matrix type way of doing it that I described is the one that tends to pop up the most. We found in our research in the most plans, in comprehensive plans, in water resources management plans, in climate adaptation plans. That's the one that you see. It's probably the most direct and simple application of it in a workshop type setting that you want to do. And even that is fairly complex, right? If you're interested in learning more about like those methods and developments on those methods, because it's not a static type of a thing, look into the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. They have a consortium for scenario planning. They have a conference every year. It's great. I've gone to it multiple times. That's how Brendan and I met. A couple authors on that topic, Robert Goodspeed, Jeremy Stapleton have written big publications on this. Janae Futrell has written about this for Planning Advisory Service Memo, a long thing on how to design a scenario planning process that is more considerate of alternative models and things like that, not just that sort of 2x2. And I'll mention again, Dr. Robert Goodspeed as well, as sort of doing this in an alternative way, right? So it's like, it is exploratory scenario planning. It's not quite the 2x2 matrix. Like they did it differently with like limited resources and limited time and limited data. And they did like this really interesting and very highly specific way of doing it. So yeah, Brendan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Okay, great, thank you. There have been a couple of questions directed to Brendan more about the workshop process. One asked how you kind of overcame the issues with the matrix approach wasn't working or leading to specific enough questions or options. How you may garner a lot of public engagement within a tight time frame. And I'm also wondering maybe you could talk about the reactions that people have had that were involved in the workshops. Like, despite challenges, were they generally pretty receptive and like positive, or how did that look?
Yeah, so I can kind of start. A lot of the responses that they gave to the sort of what is the driving force outside of your control is a lot of what's kind of going on in the community that is at risk. So housing affordability is a big one. Our demographic is an aging demographic, much like a lot of the United States. We're about 1 in 4, I think, residentially. And a kind of in the combination of that, putting a strain on the local workforce, not just in the labor market, but also the volunteer sort of pool that is so kind of critical to a lot of these actual implementations. So, in thinking about like, well, the point of the discussion is to identify how to reduce the risk, addressing housing affordability and sort of talking about community economic development and labor markets is just not really going to be effective for the plan's purpose. That's not this plan. So that was kind of one of the challenges that emerged, even though it was a very pertinent point of the conversation about we do need to be aware of that regionally because that is having a drain on our capability effort. And that's why I kind of now liken workshop one model to a capability assessment as a form of engagement. In terms of sort of their receptibility, like I said, it sort of Joe kind of alluded to it in his overview of it. It might sound a little academic and wonky, and I sort of definitely had that little nervousness feeling of just sort of saying, are we going to buy in today? Are we going to talk about? But again, just kind of giving some prompting after the conversation starts going about what is it we're facing and what is it that we're really challenged and can't seem to overcome. It was a very just kind of natural conversation. People appreciated that. I think in one group, actually, they outright said since the devastating 2020 fire season that we had in Oregon, it had been about 2 years since that time. First time they had been in a room with some of their other regional executive counterparts and talked about this issue in general in kind of their region. So I found that to be a little surprising and a little worrisome, but that was kind of a validation of like, regardless of how effective the like stuff of this is, the fact that we've got these people talking to each other about this topic is a value in of itself, and the relationship being formed through that.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in real quick, just to maybe build on that or go sideways from that. It there's maybe in a lot of the writing about this topic of exploratory scenario planning, there's like this assumption that it has to be an outwardly facing thing that's involving members of the community and like a public meeting outreach type thing. And it can be. It's really successful at doing that. It can totally be done like that. This could also be, in the context of hazard mitigation planning, a more internal exercise, maybe at the outset of your process for identifying among staff who haven't talked to each other and who could be involved with each other in different ways, who are setting out on this hazard mitigation planning, process to talk about some of these wider issues, ones that are around hazards, but ones that are also around housing growth and development and population growth and different demographics and all those other things that are important and that might allow for maybe slightly more frank conversation that can then focus things for when you do go out to the community, right? So you don't have to do this exercise out with the community. You can focus things internally through this type of an exercise with your team and then go out to the community with stuff that is more traditionally oriented around hitting the benchmarks and things that are there in a more standard hazard mitigation outreach type of an approach.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. We're less than a minute out from one. So in order to not go over time, I think we can wrap up there. But thank you very much again. As I said, everything will be posted on APA's website in the next few days. So if you want to go back to anything, review anything, you're able. And thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks, everyone.